As we continue my last week on Locked On Lightning, I'll just keep taking you guys through the season that was, beginning with an overall look at 2024 and rolling into the start of 2025.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone. I'm Josh Sperber, and I want to thank all of you for making Locked On Lightning your first listen every day. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And if your team is the Tampa Bay Lightning, then this is the show for you. And we're going to start this show by taking a look at the overall 2024 section of the 24-25 NHL season for the Tampa Bay Lightning. Yesterday, we talked about kind of the individual months of 2024 and how they shaped the season, and now the 2024 year and how that shaped the NHL season. Well, I think one of the most noticeable portions of those first 3 months was that the Lightning ended kind of the first half of the season, the first 3 months of the year, with a resoundingly winning record. 2012-2 was the Lightning's record through the first 3 months of the season, finishing with a massive goal differential of plus 38. And I think it helped kind of set up the Lightning for the rest of the year. Because if the Lightning, I think, had started on a lower level than that initial 20 and 12 record that they had, it definitely would have made, I think, the season more difficult. You know, the Lightning getting off to a strong start definitely helped kind of keep them in the playoff hunt, because we're going to talk about a little bit later just the situation that the Lightning seemed to be in after January. They had been slipping a little bit. January was the only month of the year that they had a negative goal differential. But again, that's something that we'll talk about more in the next episode. But the Lightning kind of found themselves in a pretty precarious position after what was a really strong start by all accounts to the most recent season. But the Lightning getting off to a strong start, I think, was one of the things that just continually kept them in the playoff hunt, even when, you know, the times were tougher. They weren't able to string a lot of consecutive wins together towards the middle of the season. And it just kind of established somewhat of a baseline and really set the tone for how the Lightning would finish things up. And the Lightning kind of just kept alternating between, you know, high levels and kind of lower levels. And it just seemed like the Lightning couldn't they couldn't keep everything as consistent as they did in some of their more successful months, especially like the month of December and then like February that we're going to finish this episode talking about. But you know, that was kind of that was something that really plagued the Lightning all season, was just a lack of consistency. You know, they'd go through stretches where they would just seem to be kind of winning everything. You know, they had a couple of long win streaks scattered over the course of the season, but those were also coupled with some streaks of the Lightning, you know, losing a bunch of games in a row and not competing at the level that, you know, Lightning fans, Lightning players, really anyone involved with a franchise in whatever way would expect of a team like Tampa Bay, would expect of a contending team, a team that was trying to get back to the Stanley Cup Finals, like the Lightning clearly were and will resume doing at the start of next season. But I think that was one thing that was a lot more prevalent in the first half of the season than in the second half of the season, if we're kind of splitting up by the 2024 being the first half and 2025 being the second half. Might not line up perfectly, but, just cutting through the months of the year like that, the Lightning just started off the year a bit more consistently, and there were definitely some stretches where they stayed that way, but it was not something that lasted the entire season. And that was something, especially later in the season, that I think kind of sunk Tampa Bay a little bit, was just the fact that they're playing other teams that are at the same level as they are, similar levels of talent. But the Lightning just weren't able to consistently keep up their level of play. They weren't always able to kind of play their game, and sometimes just kind of, fell behind in tough situations. But I think overall, that first half of the season, those first 3 months, were pretty indicative of the Lightning season. A couple of nice stretches, definitely some games that you'd like to have back, but they finished off the year on what you feel like should have been a good note, because you look at their month of December where they had more wins than any other month of the season other than March, where they played up to 3 more games more than they had in any month. Lightning were busiest in the month of March this last season. That's something we'll discuss tomorrow. But 7 wins in October, 8 wins in December, just kind of marred by a difficult month in between there. That shootout loss to the Flyers, I think, was one of the worst losses, I'd say, that the Lightning had all season. And, that kind of helped the Lightning turn things around. The Lightning really showed in the beginning point of the season their ability to kind of come back from adversity and bounce back after some difficult losses. I mean, the Jets game, the Wild game, the Blues game in that 4-game losing streak, the Flyers game that they ended up losing in the shootout, all of those seemed winnable for Tampa Bay. And that was really one of the few times over the course of the season where it took them a little bit just to kind of get back to the level that you'd expect of Tampa Bay, getting that 3-game win streak to follow that losing streak. But then they kind of dropped down again with a tough, OT shootout, not in terms of, the NHL shootout, but just in terms of the fact that there were 13 goals in a loss to the Blue Jackets, in which at that point they weren't the great story that Columbus was. That was, I think, one of the defining games of the Blue Jackets season, their 7-6 win over Tampa Bay in overtime. A game that the Lightning were ahead by as much as 3 goals and ended up losing 7-6. And I think that is something you can look at as a defining loss for Tampa Bay too. Just one of those games where they had the lead, they had everything going in the right direction at points, but just couldn't, keep it all together. Just couldn't, finish the job. And there were a couple other games like that over the course of the season for Tampa Bay. And sometimes those things will happen, but, they just weren't able to play a complete game in that one and a couple of different contests over the course of the season. And I think that is a pretty defining point of a way to describe the Lightning's 2024 and 2025. I mean, the record wise, it looked solid, but, you go back and you find a couple little games here and there that just kind of weaken the Lightning's chances and drop them down in the standings. And over an 82-game season, that's going to happen. But the biggest thing that I think showed in the 2024 portion of this past season was just the Lightning's inconsistency. And their inability to maintain strong performances against some of the better teams in the league. And sometimes that transferred onto games that they should have won that the Lightning just kind of let slip away. And that's something that when you look through the beginning of 2025, that is something that definitely plagued the Lightning as the season rolled on. And we're going to take a look into 2025, starting with January when we return here on Locked On Lightning. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. Personally, I love the no shells variety. It's the perfect grab and go snack for busy days. Whether I'm snacking on my desk, on a road trip, or just need a quick protein boost, they're always my go-to. And if you love cracking open every shell for that satisfying crunch, the in-shell options are always a classic favorite. So get snackin' and get crackin' with a snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. We're back on Locked On Lightning, talking about the season that was, and we're back to individual months now. We're going to go over January, which I think was one of the bigger setbacks of the season for Tampa Bay, and frankly was kind of defining portion of the year. I think it was where the Lightning faced another spell of adversity and just continued kind of alternating between the good and bad as they did at the start of the regular season. You know, you look at October through December, 7-3 with no overtime losses, 5-6-2 in November, and then 8-3, no overtime losses in December. You know, the Lightning just, again, that consistency at the start of the season just kept on alternating, and it was, I guess, their turn for a bad month in January. And we'll talk about how it kind of set up the month of February as well, because the first month of 2025 was really the only time that you felt the Lightning's playoff chances were in jeopardy, I think, during the season. I think during, you know, in any hockey season, even you look at some of the other sports like basketball and baseball, the first 2-3 months of the season just don't seem to have the same kind of implications when it comes to playoff seeding, and the pace of the division and the divisional standings. You just don't really think about that in the first 2-3 months of the year. And I think it was easy to ignore that in the 2024 portion in October, November, December, because the Lightning, for the most part, were playing so well. But, you know, in January, the playoff projections start coming out. And when you lose some of the games the Lightning did in that month, especially at the start of it, you know, it just it brings some unease to a team that was already kind of uncertain about the expectations that you might have for Tampa Bay. And it just kind of seemed like in January, it was, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back just about every time, because, you know, you look at some of the games that the Lightning had against repeat teams over the month of January. They played the Ducks twice, lost on the road 4-1, and then won 4-3 in a shootout at home a couple of weeks later. You know, the Kings, they started and ended the month with Los Angeles, a playoff team. They lost 2-1 in LA. Kings came home, Kings came to Tampa. The Lightning won 3-0 right after They had lost 4-1 to the Blackhawks at home, a team they had beaten 4-3 in overtime in Chicago. And, you can keep looking at some of the teams the Lightning played twice, getting that overtime loss to the Devils, a team that they had already beaten multiple times in 2024. Lightning took 2 of 3 games from New Jersey over the course of the season, but a team that the Lightning beat pretty handily twice, they lost to in overtime. And then you have kind of the middle of the month where the 2 games you want to get both did not go well the second time for Tampa Bay. A big 4-1 win against Boston, a divisional team, kind of before the Bruins' bigger collapse. And then less than a week later, they're in Boston and lose 6-2. Similar situation with the Red Wings. Detroit comes to Tampa Bay, and the Lightning beat them handily, 5-1, a game that never really seemed to be a contest. And then that week, they go on a 4-game road trip. They lose 2 divisional games to the Leafs and to the Canadiens. Then after what seemed like a bounce-back win against Chicago, they go and drop 2 more games in a row. The second game losing to Chicago after a 2-0 loss against the Red Wings. And that was one of the rare times that the Lightning were shut out over the course of the season. I mean, this was a team that led the NHL in goals for and led the NHL in goals per game. And they're getting shut out by a divisional team that was, definitely on the up and up. I think the early part of 2024 was when the Red Wings really started to surge and put their name back in playoff contention. But, it just going to Detroit and losing that game was just kind of a backbreaker. And it just kind of kept with the flow of January, because it seemed like for the most part, the month just did not go the Lightning's way. They were 7-8-1 over the course of January. They had a goal differential of -3, the only negative goal differential that the Lightning had in any given month aside from the postseason. And that was really the one time that I think other Lightning fans might agree, but it was the one time for me that the thought entered my mind of the Lightning potentially missing the postseason. Because if they kept going like they did in January, dropping games that they maybe should have won, looking at that first game of the new year against the Sharks, they had chances against their division rivals in Toronto and Montreal. That 4-1 loss at home against Chicago seemed preventable. I mean, you can nitpick through all these games and look at different examples of how it felt like the Lightning should have stayed ahead or should have been ahead here, or, this should have happened and things like that. And then there was the whole comment from John Cooper, which I believe he mentioned, which I believe he said at a game in January. But, I mean, this was definitely the month of the year where opposing goaltenders were toughest on Tampa Bay. John Cooper made a comment about how the Tampa Bay Lightning just made the opposing goalie, no matter who it was, look like a Vezina finalist. And, that happened quite a bit. You look at the stars of the game over the course of the Lightning losses in January, and the opposing goalie is featured on a whole host of them. In only one of those losses in January, did the Lightning score more than 2 goals in a game. That was the 5-3 loss against Toronto. Other than that, every one of their losses had 2 goals or less, and the majority of them had 1 goal from Tampa Bay. So January, I think, was the month of adversity for the Tampa Bay Lightning, which obviously in the moment doesn't exactly feel good. But when you look at how it impacted February, it was something that I think the Lightning needed to go through. And I think you can make that argument for any other NHL team that you need kind of a month of adversity. You just need something is going to go wrong. You don't want it to happen, but good teams can use that adversity. They can use that, any negative points, any low moments, they can use that to their advantage and use it to kind of bounce back and, show the rest of the league who they really are. And I think that's what happened when the calendar turned from January to February. It was really kind of an enough is enough moment for the Tampa Bay Lightning. And the month of February, I think, was the biggest reason that the Tampa Bay Lightning were a playoff team in this past year. So we're going to take one last break and then look back at one of the most important months of the Lightning's recent season in the month of February 2025. So we talked about the month of January, the Lightning going through adversity. Couldn't string together too many consecutive wins. Didn't win more than 2 straight games over the month of January. They didn't lose more than 3 straight games in that month either. And the thing about the month of January was that it ended on a really strong note for the Tampa Bay Lightning. The Lightning got a shutout win at home against the LA Kings, who were one of the better teams in the Western Conference all season long, and a team that gave the Lightning a lot of trouble when they went to LA earlier in the month. So with that game in mind, the Lightning started the month of February with a home tilt against the New York Islanders, a kind of middle of the pack or lower team in the NHL all season long. It seemed like it was, a home game. The Lightning were great at home on the season. They had kind of been slipping a little bit over the course of the last month, as I mentioned. But the Lightning ended up losing that game to New York to start off February at home, a game that they got the lead in the first period, lost it in the third, and then Nikita Kucherov with a great snapshot to tie it up late in the third, and then an overtime goal within the first minute of the overtime period sunk Tampa Bay. And that really seemed like just rock bottom, I feel like, for a lot of the Lightning players. That was a game that they felt that they could have and should have won. They had enough shots. They did what they needed to do. And it was in front of their home fans. And it just didn't end up going the Lightning's way. And I wish I could give you a better idea of what happened in the Lightning locker room after that game. But the closest I can come to is just the Lightning locked in after that first loss against the Islanders, heading into an alternating back-to-back against the Ottawa Senators. One day off in between 2 games in a row at Amalie Arena with the Senators, a team that had really emerged onto the scene at that point of the year as one of the upstart young teams who were going to challenge for a playoff spot. They played 2 games at Amalie Arena where the Lightning were strongest over the course of the season. After that loss against the Islanders, the Lightning had dropped into 5th out of immediate playoff contention ahead of those 2 games against Ottawa. And it just felt like the Lightning really needed to win both of those games to get back on track. And that spawned their longest win streak of the season. They won the last 4 games before the Four Nations tournament, including the, first half finale, as it were, against the Montreal Canadiens on the Sunday before Four Nations, when Nikita Kucherov was scratched during warmups. Lightning ended up winning 8 games in a row going into the first game of March. And most of those games against Eastern Conference teams, half of those games against their own division. Those 2 back-to-back wins against the Senators, I think, might be the biggest reason that the Tampa Bay Lightning made the postseason. Just the momentum that they gained from those two victories, increasing in just about every way. Things got a little bit chippy at the end of the 4-3 win against the Senators, the first of those two back-to-backs. Linus Ullmark had got back in net for Ottawa for the first time in a long time. The Senators even picked up the first goal and tied the game pretty quickly after the Lightning took their first lead on a Nikita Kucherov power play marker. And then the third period, the Lightning took the lead for good, got themselves an empty netter that ended up proving to be crucial as Drake Batherson came up with a late goal to put the Senators back within one in the final 2 minutes. Then things got a little bit chippy at the end, and you just kind of felt that the Senators were going to come back with a vengeance the next game. And they tried, but the Lightning beat them down 5-1. And, there was a point kind of halfway through the first period, the Senators had tied the game, but that was just another one of those enough is enough sort of games. And to add insult to injury, the Lightning even got an even strength goal after their empty netter, which ended up being Chernak's first goal of the NHL season. The Lightning put in 2 goals in the final 2 minutes, and at that point, that Mitchell Chaffee goal, his 10th of the season to make it 5-1, final goal of the game with less than 30 seconds left, that was, I think, just a huge momentum boost that helped carry the Lightning through the rest of the win streak. Because, I think it was enough in terms of getting that momentum boost and getting that extra bit of confidence to beat the same team, an upstart divisional team, twice in a row, twice in 3 days. But to do it in the dominant fashion that they did in that second game against Ottawa was just such a big confidence boost that it carried the Lightning through the rest of the month. Because after Four Nations, the Lightning got a lot of their team back. J.J. Moser came back from injury in the Lightning's first game after Four Nations, a 4-1 win against the Seattle Kraken. That is always a big boost when you get a guy who's a regular starter back from a 2-month layoff due to injury. Gage Gonzalez at that point had really kicked his game up into high gear. He came back after getting sent down to the AHL to get some extra experience over the course of Four Nations. And he just was on a tear leading into Four Nations. He had an assist in the last 3 games before the Four Nations face-off, picked up an apple against Edmonton, got one in the last game of the win streak against the Capitals, had a few games without scoring, and just from there, it seemed like he was either getting a goal or an assist or, having the third pass away from the goal. He was just such a key part of the Lightning offense, and that really solidified itself in the month of February. I think that month of any individual point in the season was the biggest turning point for Gage Gonzalez in what ended up being just a really great finish to the NHL season. He turned into a guy from a guy who was just trying to make a name for himself and, put himself out there in front of the Lightning coaches and make a statement that he could, be an important piece on this Lightning roster to, okay, he is here. He's an NHL player now. He's not going back to the AHL. He really solidified that. I didn't talk about as much in the month of January where the Lightning were able to try out a couple of guys, unfortunately due to injury sometimes, but they were able to get some of their younger defensemen like Declan Carlisle, Max Crozier up into the game. That was the second in January and February were 2 points in the season where the Lightning were really able to get some of their younger guys out there and see what they had. And I think it really showed that they've got some defenders in their farm system that can make an impact sooner rather than later, and maybe even this year. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Max Crozier and Declan Carlisle end up being a whole line on the Tampa Bay Lightning defense. I mean, that the Lightning just have that strength, I think, in some of their defensive players. And with those two especially, those are two guys that are both young, both 25, that you might be able to see early and often in the NHL starting next season. So that's something that we'll certainly watch for going forward. But I think the month of February, I don't think it can be argued that there was a better month for the Tampa Bay Lightning. It set them up for their playoff run, which was admittedly disappointing. But, you know, the Lightning, I don't think would have been at the level that they were record-wise in their division at the end of the season without those 7 wins in the last 7 games of February. And that is where we're going to leave it for today. My last show will be tomorrow. So for the penultimate time, I want to thank you for making Locked On Lightning your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out the all-new Locked On NHL Game Night. Every game, every night until the Stanley Cup champion is crowned. Get local analysis on a national scale. Find NHL Game Night on Locked On NHL on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And please give us a like, follow, subscribe wherever you found this podcast. Might be leaving soon, but we do appreciate your support here on Locked On Lightning. So thank you again for tuning in. And for one last time, I'll see you guys tomorrow.